You're listening to Why We Do What We Do. Welcome to Why We Do What We Do Mini. I'm your host, Abraham.
And I'm Shane.
Slay Queen, no cap.
Ugh.
All right.
Yeah. That made me throw up a little bit.
Yeah. So did everyone just cringe so hard that they cracked their teeth? I understand, because we are talking about expressions today. We've actually talked about idioms a number of times, but this one's unique. These are going to be this is a whole different thing.
Yeah, this is like when something comes up and it's used a lot, and then it kind of dies off, over time because it's just not useful for folks anymore, or they don't really care about it anymore, or it just doesn't contact any reward anymore because now adults have found it and kids hate us for it.
There's this really unique cultural selection of language. There's this ongoing, I think, language evolves. And so these sort of new phrases and sayings and slang and idioms sort of pop into existence. And that's how bootylicious ended up in the dictionary.
Which is true, by the way. If you all want to look up bootylicious, it is in the Webster's dictionary, which is just fascinating to me. I just think that that's so fun.
Right.
No shade towards Beyonce. It's just more so that bootylicious is the word that ended up in the dictionary now. And we're just kind of like, as a culture, we've been okay with that.
No shade is kind of its own expression. And most people listening to us who are our age will remember expressions such as sick and diss and bling and calling someone dog, but spelled D-A-W-G, and what's crackin', and home skillet, and saying bad when something is good. And then stop trying to make fetch happen. Just fetch. People saying fetch.
Yeah, it's
and some of these are even kind of still around. Like, I think people still say sick a lot. I feel like I still hear that.
I hear sweet still, like somebody calling something sweet. Like, oh yeah, that's sweet. Like I hear that often.
Oh yeah. Someone learning English for the first time would have maybe a hard time wrapping their head around that use of the word sweet in that context to say great, basically.
Right. That's exactly it. Now we have terms like yeet and slay and cap and riz, and I hate that I had to say all of those, and a bunch of other random phrases that feel like made up nonsense, but that's kind of how our phrasing felt to generations before us. And actually that's kind of a fun thing to think about, what we were saying when we were kids and our parents were hearing us say and how much they hated that. Like, we were kind of talking about this before we recorded today. And some of the slang that kind of stuck with us too, right? Like, we are both children of the 90s.
Yeah.
So we got stuck with kind of like the extreme sports, like kind of like surfer lingo, like radical and awesome. And, and it kind of evolved into like, you'll hear people our age say dope still, like something is dope.
Yeah.
But like this, which is fine. Like, but it's funny because like, I say, and we were kind of talking about this, I say gnarly still. Like, I'm like, oh man, that's gnarly.
Yeah.
Or rad. I'm like, oh my God, that's so rad. And I'll say that, which is...
I love rad.
Rad is such a great term. But again, that's generational. It's very specific to our generation. Like, people that are much younger are like, did you say rad? Don't say that. It's gross. But I think it's fascinating that kind of every generation has that.
Yeah, exactly. And it always will. Like, this is just going to keep going. This has been going on for some time. And that's sort of the path that we're on. And I think it's worth acknowledging, like, it feels weird for us to say things like yeet and slay and everything, because like it's past the time where we were still participating in the sort of evolution of the language treadmill that is expressions and idioms. And like the kids who are using these terms these days will continue using them, and then their kids will be like, ew, you're old. Like, why are you saying that weird stuff?
Yeah.
A lot of them will die off. Some of them will, like, I think even Riz has kind of already sort of dug its own grave, but some of them will probably stay around for a while.
Well, and I think this is a really important thing to remember is that, like, maybe in this context, and maybe this is something that we can do on another mini, but it's the kids that come up with what's cool and trendy. The kids are the ones that do that, not adults.
That's right.
Adults have never been cool. We are not trendy. We are not cool. It's the kids who do that. And so when adults start using terms that the kids use, the kids go, that's not cool anymore. We've moved on. And that's important, I think, to remember.
Yeah.
Is that if you are in your 20s or 30s and you're saying Riz, then that means you have already aged out of cool.
And then those kids will become adults, and then then their kids will be making up the new terms. So which of these expressions stand the test of time? It seems like the most useful ones are the ones that, and the most sort of more commonly adopted and more widespread. Those ones really seem to. But what I thought would be fun is to considering this, all these weird expressions that exist, and there's so many that we use now that it seem really weird, and that they seemed weird when they were invented to people before us. They seem weird to people who came after us, and they probably won't stand the test of time. And so I thought it'd be fun to discuss some of these old timey ones that people don't really use anymore that did not stand the test of time, just to highlight this sort of weird language treadmill that we're on. Maybe our discussion will even revive some of them, but probably not.
Yeah, probably not. So the first one that we're going to talk about is ads.
That was such a 2024 one to do, where ads have taken over.
Uh-huh.
The actual first one here is know your onions. Have you heard this one before?
Never heard this phrase. Never in my life have I heard this one.
Okay. I had not heard know your onions. This is from the 1920s. Essentially, this just meant know your stuff. And apparently, you could also say know your kumquats, which means you apparently don't know your stuff, is what I saw on the website here. So know your onions, I guess, means know your, like, you know what you're talking about.
Yeah. Okay. All right. There's also make a whoopee, which I'm going to say I have heard make whoopee, which we're going to talk about, but make a whoopee, I had not heard.
Yeah.
You'd heard this before, right?
No, not make a whoopee. It does to me, like, this sounds like a euphemism for going poop.
Which is hilarious. I love that.
Yeah, I had not heard make a whoopee before.
Yeah. So it's another 1920s phrase that meant to have a great time, often or usually in the context of throwing a party. So making a whoopee was throwing a party. I would imagine whoopee being the phrase whoopee, like kind of that.
Yeah.
It evolved eventually to just meaning you're having sex. Like making whoopee is just having sex.
Yeah, 1920s parties were probably a lot of that.
Yeah.
This is a weird one. Okay, so this was a name for something. It was called a trick cyclist. Have you heard that one before?
No, I hadn't heard this one.
So apparently this started in the 1890s, and they said, say it fast, and that'll help you. So I'm like, all right, trick cyclist. I still didn't get it. Apparently, I'd actually looked this up separately. This is referring to a psychiatrist. So I guess it's because they kind of sound similar, trick cyclist and psychiatrist. And I was like, this sounds like you asked a 4-year-old to say psychiatrist, and what they said was trick cyclist. And they're like, ha, that's great. Let's call them trick cyclists from now on. Which, sure.
I mean, honestly, that is the highest form of comedy. When your friends say a word wrong or say a phrase wrong, and then you just lay into them forever about how they said this thing wrong. That's what comedy is.
That really is.
That's a mark of a good friendship. You know?
Comedy gold right there.
Comedy gold. There's also the term bean counter. I have definitely heard this. I've heard this one a lot.
I heard it before too, I think.
Yeah, I think it's around.
Yeah.
So in the 1960s, this was about an accountant, but it started to mean someone who handles finances. So basically what it means is a bean counter is just somebody who handles money, counts coins, and all that stuff. Like, or just kind of like keeps track of finances. That's what a bean counter is.
Yeah. The beans.
Yeah.
This is another interesting one. It was send them to Coventry. From that phrasing, you might even be able to get what this is referring to. There was no clear date on when this rose to popularity or when it fell out of it. Have you heard send them to Coventry?
No, I have never heard the word Coventry used outside of the neighborhood I grew up in. I grew up in a neighborhood called Coventry Forest, and I have never bothered to look up what the word Coventry meant.
I think there's also even a city called Coventry. But what this refers to in this case, you would say someone to Coventry when you were ostracizing someone or maybe giving them the silent treatment. So it was someone has done something, we want to show them they're wrong by cutting them out of social things. You're sending them to Coventry is the saying. So kind of a weird one, but that was the thing.
Yeah. There's also Tickety Boo, which I'd never heard of. And it sounds like a candy you'd find in Willy Wonka's Chocolate Factory.
Yeah. Or like something you might say to an infant.
Yeah, exactly. In the early 1900s, this meant that everything was fine or sort of, quote, all good here. Kind of like, yeah, it's fine. So somebody might ask, how was your flight? Maybe not in the early 1900s. Maybe later, right? Early, they'd be like, how was your 5-mile-an-hour drive on the car?
Ride?
How was your carriage ride? You know, how are your horses? You know, and they might respond, quite tickety-boo, thanks. But I imagine they said it like this. They probably, you see? Quite tickety-boo. They did the 1920s like radio announcer voice. That's how people talked back then.
Sure. Yeah. So apparently tickety-boo just meaning like, oh yeah, it's all good. Thanks. Man, that's a hard one to imagine and trying to incorporate into modern vernacular.
Could you imagine trying to make that cool?
Like, how's your coffee? Tickety-boo. They're like, are you having a stroke? Do you need help? Should I ban you from entering my establishment ever again for uttering that phrase in front of me?
Yeah, what are you doing? Are you human? Somebody who says tickety-boo now would never pass a I'm not a robot CAPTCHA.
For multiple reasons, really. But yeah, you're right.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. So, some things move from slang to simply fully embedded into our language, too. So some things that we now accept as being sort of common terms were once these sort of idiomatic expressions. And one of them is the word creepy, which was invented by Charles Dickens.
Yeah. And, I think that's something that's really interesting about all of this, right? There are expressions that die, that come back, or they end up making it in kind of going back to what we said at the top of the episode, where these words or these phrases will end up kind of becoming commonplace. And we did an episode on idioms that kind of talk about this, but the idea that like something will move from being metaphorical or kind of like weird or slang, and as it gains practicality, will move into a space where it will be useful and kind of stay on the test of time. It will continue forward. And there's lots of phrases that we have inside of our own language that have done that. And, I think the one thing I say often that has kind of stood the test of time is dude. I say dude all the time.
Yeah. There are quite a few, I think, and there are some that has even become nearly technical jargon. They're used so often and been so fully incorporated into our language. And language is just going to keep doing that. It's going to keep evolving. It's going to keep changing. Some things will become offensive while other things will become more normal. Some things will become slang while some of those slangs might become part of the language. It's just how language evolves, and that's totally okay. And so the sort of, but why though section of this is, first of all, as you said, see our episode on idioms. But yeah, just as a quick summary of that, slang and phrases and expressions, they're like quick cultural shorthand for communicating often in a fun, contemporarily relevant way, and often has sort of an inside joke type of feel. So I think it's sort of stimulating in that way that it sort of just makes you laugh a little. And also like it just becomes a efficiency thing too. People often will use shorthand idioms instead of sayings to communicate a lot.
Yeah, exactly. Like we said, there are some things that will stay and some things that will not. And you'd never know until it does. I can't imagine that Riz is going to stay around for a while, but you just never know. 100 years from now, somebody will be like, man, that's Riz.
As in that's charisma.
Yeah. Don't misuse it, but it'll be fun.
Fair enough. I think moral of the story, people say the darndest things.
That's the best way to end that, for sure.
I think that's all we have to say about this. Anything you'd like to add or anything that I forgot?
Stay red.
Thank you all for listening. This is Abraham.
And this is Shane.
Why We Do What We Do Mini is out.
Bye.
You've been listening to Why We Do What We Do. You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to www.wwdpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope you have an awesome day.